Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the AV Room. I'm your host, Christopher Chenard, and today we're going to be talking about heavy metal. Heavy Metal, the 1981 movie, not Heavy Metal, the magazine, although that's where it got its inspiration. Heavy Metal, the movie, was released in 1981 by Columbia Pictures, produced by Ivan Reitman, and did quite well at the movies. I got to see it when I was 11 years old after my mom and dad got into a fight. Dad decided he was going to storm out of the house, and I decided to tag along. Why don't we go see Heavy Metal? I asked my dad, to which he replied, Sure, whatever, get in the car. So off we drove to the mall to see the midnight movie debut the day it came out of Heavy Metal, a movie which inspired me in ways I can never imagine. Now, my dad took me to midnight movies whenever he got into arguments, and I always was able to con him out of some popcorn and occasionally a souvenir book. This was the souvenir book that I got in 1981 when I was 11. God bless my dad. I asked him, "Hey, Dad, why don't you give me that book? I can use it to draw pictures from," because I was an aspiring artist at the time. These things probably were not cheap. $7 back then is not what $7 is now. But he bought it for me as well as a tub of popcorn. And then he said, I got to hit the John, kid. Uh, just keep an eye on the popcorn and look at your magazine. I'll be right back. And that's when I spotted this. The movie poster was hanging right by the men's room. So what did old Chris do? Backed the bottom of the frame, pulled the poster out, rolled it up, and stuck it in my pant leg. Yep, I was a thief back then. So we went inside to see the movie, started the movie, and about 20 minutes in, we heard somebody throwing up. It was a midnight movie after all. Many people came in imbibed. So my dad walked out, talked to the projectionist, and said, is there any chance you can start this movie over? This is, of course, after they escorted the guy out and cleaned up after him. The projectionist said, Sure, no problem. So I got to see Heavy Metal, the movie, one and a half times the day it came out. Plus, got the poster and the movie program. It was a great day for Chris. The next day, I decided I was going to save up all my allowance money and buy the soundtrack. The soundtrack had been released, and I knew about it because on my way home from school every day, there was a record store. And I would routinely bop in the record store and check out the walls and see whatever new releases had come out. My go to section was always the soundtracks. I went right for the soundtracks and tried to find my favorite movies, rifling through them one after another, and that's where I found Heavy Metal. Now, Heavy Metal was weird in the fact that they had released two soundtracks, a score by Elmer Bernstein, and then the soundtrack, which was a double LP with all the tracks and songs from the movie, or so I thought. Now, to roll it back a little bit, that same summer, my grandmother, who just passed away, unfortunately, took me to Florida with my older brother. Upon going to Florida, she stopped by a mall and said, Why don't we go into the bookstore and see if we can find some books for you kids to read? That's where I found this. It's The Art of the Movie, Heavy Metal by Carl Masick. Now, later on down the road, when they released this movie on DVD and eventually Laserdisc, Blu ray, maybe even 4K, I haven't stayed up, but this is the copy that I got in the 90s. Um, she had gotten me this book, and in it was a photograph. It tells all about the movie. You can see here, it tells all about the movie. I think this is out of print, but I'm not 100% sure. But this is my copy from 1981. But I read this on the way to Epcot Center in Disney, and inside it was a photograph of this gentleman. That's Michael Gross. Now, the name Michael Gross was familiar to me because a couple years earlier, when I was 9, I got this book, The Art of Alien. And its author was Paul Scanlon and Michael Gross. Michael Gross, the same Michael Gross that's photographed in this book. Now, Michael Gross was the production designer on Heavy Metal. Michael was born in 1945 and passed in 2015 due to cancer. He had designed and refined Dan Aykroyd's No Ghost logo that Dan had originally sketched later in 1984 when he was the production designer and associate producer on the film Ghostbusters. But earlier in 1981, Michael had been hired to be the production designer on Heavy Metal. Now, prior to that, Michael was an assistant to both Andy Warhol and John Lennon. And when I met Michael in California years later, after meeting my wife, we moved to California. We had opened an art gallery. Now, doing promotion for that art gallery, I ran into somebody and said, we should go down to the beach and we should hand out flyers. And there's some people I think that could help us with this. And I said, well, who do you think could help us promote the gallery? And they said, Mike Gross. He's a pretty famous Hollywood guy. Now, at the time, I thought when he said Mike Gross that they were talking about the dad on Family Ties, because that's the only Mike Gross I think most people would know. Most people wouldn't know the Mike Gross that I knew from the art of the movie, the picture of Mike Gross in here. So we're walking along the beach, we're handing out flyers. And he says, oh, this is Mike Gross's house. Let's knock on the door and see if he's there. So he knocks on the door opens up, there's Mike Gross. My jaw hit the floor. I about had a heart attack. I said, Ma, 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 you're Mike Gross. To which he replied, yeah, and? And I said, no, you don't understand. I know who you are. I've known who you are since I was 11. I'm a huge fan of yours. My mom used to subscribe to National Lampoon, and I am a huge fan of heavy metal. To which he replied, oh, no biggie, that was years ago. Why don't you come on in? He brought me inside his house and let me look through everything. And I mean everything. He had scrapbooks for every year of his life. And in those scrapbooks were photographs of he and John Lennon, notes from John Lennon, drawings from Andy Warhol, picture after picture after picture of all the movies that he worked on. He wore many hats on many movies, including Kindergarten Cop, Ghostbusters, the aforementioned Heavy Metal, and many others. In fact, years later, when South Park did a tribute to heavy metal, I remember saying to Mike, I can't believe they didn't get hold of you. And he said, yeah, I can't believe didn't get hold of me either. Now, I did see that episode of Heavy Metal. It was season 12, titled Major Boobage. And they used a lot of songs from the movie. And he said, I really could have helped them with a direction so it emulated the movie more. And I said, well, they did a pretty good job. And he goes, yeah, but I would have liked to have gotten paid and got some credit for it. Anyways, they didn't ask me. That's when I asked Mike, would you mind doing the ribbon cutting for our gallery? To which he replied, sure, no problem, kid. I think he liked the attention. And a couple days later, he had told me he had never been so flattered in his life that I was such a big fan. It didn't happen very often, and he felt left out by the movie industry after all his successes because I think he thought that they just didn't need him anymore. They could do it for cheaper using CGI or hiring somebody else. And he was always bummed that after Ghostbusters 2, they didn't ask him to be part of anything else, including the major boobage episode of South Park. But I digress. We're here mostly to talk about the soundtrack. Now, Mike had told me at that gallery opening, with my many questions, that he was the one who helped compile the soundtrack. He said they had worked out a deal and they were allowed to pick from various songs that these artists hadn't put on albums or hadn't released. And that's specifically what they wanted. Pieces that were either written specifically for Heavy Metal, the movie, or pieces by major artists that hadn't been on any of their solo albums or any of their band albums. So we'll go into that in a sec. Now, aside from South Park, Heavy Metal, the movie, was also credited as being an inspiration for Elon Musk in 2018 when he shot a Tesla Roadster in outer space. It was also a deep inspiration for director David Fincher, the man who directed Seven, amongst many other things. David Fincher eventually retooled his conceptually heavy metal TV series for Netflix into Love, Death, and Robots in 2019. So if you think about Love, Death, and Robots as a spiritual heir to heavy metal, that's exactly what it is, was because it was supposed to be a heavy metal TV series for Netflix. Now, the soundtrack to heavy metal was released as a double LP in 1981. There was no CD released until 1995. Now, during my gallery opening, Mike had given me this heavy metal flip book, and it's literally a flip book that you can get two different scenes from. And I told you this was adult. And when you flip through it, just like the ones you would draw as a kid, you get basically a cartoon of the bird flying and of Tarna being attacked. Now, quite adult in nature, this flip book was given out to people who subscribed to Preview magazine, a magazine which was associated with artist Jim Steranko, who had used it to sort of get his way into Hollywood. Amongst other things, he was the production designer on Raiders of the Lost Ark and done all the early conceptual work before Harrison Ford was hired. Now, being as I had this book, I knew a lot about heavy metal already, and I knew that there was a soundtrack. So I had to save my hard earned money, and I did indeed find the soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack was released in 1981, and I was aware of the soundtrack because on my way home from school every day, I would walk by Harmony House Records. I would go in there and I'd flip through the soundtrack section because that's mostly what I was interested in. Although they did have a lot of Kiss, a lot of Black Sabbath, and a lot of the other records I would go on to love and collect in this collection here. But at the time, that was a lot of money. I believe, if I recall correctly, it was $14.99 when I bought it. And it was a lot of lunch money that I had to save up to buy the album. I no longer have my original album. It was released in 1981, and I lost it during various breakups. And eventually, years later, I got a Rue LP set, and the first record was side A and side D, and the second record was side B and side C. And it was done like that. So when you had the record, many people had a stackable record player, which you put one record right over the other one. And when one got done playing, the second one would drop down, your arm would come back over, and it would play in sequence. Now, years later, when it was re released in 2017 as part of the Rocktober series from Rhino, they relabeled it sides A, B, C, D, because we no longer use stackable record players. Now, at the same time, there was a soundtrack instrumental version released, which was quite rare at the time. Now, this soundtrack was done by Elmer Bernstein, who years later in 1984 worked again with Ivan Reitman on Ghostbusters. There was originally no CD release for Heavy Metal the movie until 1995. And in 1996, when Kevin Eastman finally re released the film on home video and DVD, this is my copy, as the louder and nastier than ever cut, he finally cleared up all the music rights issues. And see, that was the problem. Because of the amount of bands on the soundtrack, nobody had done label rights or re-release rights beyond the original 2 LP set. And no one saw CD coming, much less streaming all these years later. So they had to renegotiate with everyone on the soundtrack in order to get it re-released on CD. Now, some cool facts about the album. This was the album in which Blue Oyster Cult had written a song called Vengeance the Pact for the last segment, Tarna, but it was rejected. Instead, they used Veterans of the Psychic War, both which can be found on Blue Oyster Cult's Fire of the Unknown album. Devo had also recorded 2 songs, Through Being Cool and Working in the Coal Mine. However, while they can both be found on their New Traditionalist album, only Working in the Coal Mine was put on Heavy Metal's soundtrack. Black Sabbath is another band that had recorded 2 songs, E5150 and The Mob Rules. Now, E5150 is not on the heavy metal soundtrack, while the Mob Rules is. However, the version of the Mob Rules found on the heavy metal soundtrack is a demo and differs from its eventual release on the album Mob Rules. Which brings me to my favorite points. I had mentioned earlier that Donald Fagen had taken a break from Steely Dan and was beginning to work on solo material that would eventually become his album, The Nightfly. However, the first solo thing that he ever worked on was from Heavy Metal, the movie. The song is called True Companion and predates The Nightfly as Donald Fagen's first release. The other interesting thing was Stevie Nicks was working on her first solo album, Belladonna. And for Belladonna, she had come up with a song called Blue Lamp. Now, this is a re release years later that I picked up that does have Blue Lamp on the second. It's a 2 album set, and it has Blue Lamp on the second album of this. But prior to this special edition, also a record store day exclusive, 2 LP, 180 gram, early and alternate takes, and soundtrack cuts. And you can see there soundtrack cuts. This was only found on the heavy metal soundtrack album. Now, the version of the heavy metal soundtrack album that I have is this one. Now, this was a Rocktober release. You can see there, Rocktober release. And has that hype sticker and then this hype sticker at the top, which reads Classic 80s soundtrack now back on vinyl. Includes Black Sabbath, The Mob Rules, Cheap Trick, I Must Be Dreamin', and Sammy Hagar, Heavy Metal. A side note, Sammy Hagar's Heavy Metal is also an alternate version and differs from the heavy metal that he had released later on his own solo album. So you get several cuts that you can't get anywhere else but this soundtrack. And that makes it quite unique and one of my favorite albums. Now, this gatefold replicates the original soundtrack release from 1981 and has Richard Corbin art on the back and all the track listings on the side there, as you can see. We've got Black Sabbath, The Mob Rules, Blue Oyster Cult, Veteran of the Psychic Wars, Cheap Trick, Reach Out, and I Must Be Dreamin', Devo's Working in a Coal Mine, Donald Fagen's True Companion, Don Felder of the Eagles, All of You and Heavy Metal Taking a Ride, Grand Funk Railroad's Queen Bee, Sammy Hagar's Heavy Metal, Journey's Open Arms, Nazareth Crazy, A Suitable Case for Treatment, Stevie Nicks' Blue Lamp, Riggs, Radar Rider and Heartbeat, and Trust Prefabricated. The album was compiled by Irving Arzoff, Howard Kaufman, and Bob Distocki, and the album executive producer was Irving Arzoff. The executive producer of Heavy Metal, Leonard Mogul, screenplay by Don Goldberg and Len Blum, produced by Ivan Reitman, and directed by Gerald Potterton. Now, the album comes with 2 album sleeves, which give you song credits and album credits. Simple black sleeves with album titles and credits for each song. Now, the recording for A&M Studios was done by Bernie Grunman, mastering by Bob Distocki and Jim Scheffler, and sounds fantastic. Now, I'd like to find an original copy, but I'm happy just to have one. And this has been released a few times since this on red vinyl. However, the copy I have, and I'll show you the labels right there, Heavy Metal and Heavy Metal. Now, these are the correct side 2, side 1, and side 3 and side 4. And just to show you, are just simply plain black. However, like I stated, there is a red vinyl version of this out there floating around. I opted for the black. Now, aside from this, I also have a copy of Elmer Bernstein's soundtrack, which is Heavy Metal, the score. And there's the back. There's a picture of Elmer Bernstein. and it's got a sticker on it of an original price of $6.29. Wouldn't you love to buy an album for $6.29 these days? Now, this has two sides, and the 12 songs. And it was performed by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Elmer Bernstein, with recording engineer of Keith Grant. And you can see he's wearing a Heavy Metal, the movie t shirt right there while he's conducting. Now, Elmer Bernstein is a legend. This was one of my favorite albums growing up. And let's see if I can find the vinyl. Here we go. So this is the vinyl, and you can see the label there. Now, both these records, both the instrumental version and the soundtrack version, were originally put out on Full Moon Asylum. And the original pressings were both also black vinyl only. You can see it right there. I've had these vinyls for quite some time. They've gotten a lot of play. So much so, in fact, when I ended up getting rid of most of my record collection, I had replaced many of them with CDs. And this was a CD that I got. Now, this is a bootleg CD of the score because after the album went out of print, it was very hard to get. Now, years later, I know they have re released the Elmer Bernstein version on CD. If I can find it, I'll insert a picture of it here for you. But as you can see, I'm quite the heavy metal fan. And when I had met all those years later Mike Gross, and I had him do the ribbon cutting for our gallery, I showed him the movie poster that I stole from the movie theater in 1981 and had him sign it. And I'll have a little insert here, as well as his business card that he gave me, because when I moved from California back to Michigan, we did stay in touch until his passing. And I have a lot of good memories hanging out with Mike and talking to Mike. What a legend. So that's the episode on heavy metal soundtrack. If you never thought that Donald Fagen, Black Sabbath, Cheap Trick, Journey, Don Felder, and Stevie Nicks all made an album together, well, not really, but they kind of did. And this is it. And it's been a favorite of mine my entire life. Well, since age 11. And speaking of Steely Dan, you can see my guitar back here. That is my autographed Donald Fagen Walter Becker guitar that I got when they played in the Palace of Auburn Hills in Michigan. And that coincidentally was the only time that Steely Dan ever played True Companion from this album live. So Steely Dan covered a Donald Fagen solo song live in Detroit, and this kid was there. I was an usher at the time and had no idea how special a night that was. Well, thank you for listening and watching. And as always, like and subscribe. And as I now always say, waka waka waka.